Welcome back. Just over a year ago, Hurricane Maria laid waste to much of Puerto Rico. It is safe to say thousands of Puerto Ricans never imagined the next big election they'd be voting in would be as residents of Florida. Now, a federal judge is ordering 32 Florida counties, including Sarasota and Manatee, to print sample ballots in Spanish. Is it the right thing to do? And joining us for more are Kramer Verde, an activist in the Sarasota Hispanic community, Rod Thompson of the RevolutionaryAct.com, and Ron Turner, Sarasota's election supervisor. So Ron, let me start with you. Do I have this correct that the judge's ruling is in response to all the Puerto Ricans who resettled in Florida after Hurricane Maria?
That's my understanding from the suit that was filed in federal court in the Northern District. So the groups that filed suit primarily against Alachua County and the state, but also 31 other counties in Florida, including Sarasota and Manatee counties, did address, that was their primary concern, were Puerto Rican voters that had relocated from Puerto Rico to Florida in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria.
So, Rod, take that issue on itself. These are people who never, as I said, expected to be here during this election season. And, you know, in Puerto Rico, the primary language is Spanish, although many speak English. There are English signs and so forth. But still, as an immediate matter, what's the objection to people who have been thrust into this situation through no fault of their own, you know, having Spanish ballots?
Right. So for me personally, there's no objection in this specific instance. When I was telling Jess Dodrick, you know, that I'm opposed to the broad philosophical concept of you know, many languages instead of one dominant language. That was that, but I have an asterisk, I told her, next to it, and that's this particular case because of exactly what you say. Puerto Ricans are American citizens. They have full American citizen rights. They live on an island in which Spanish is the language, so they don't need to learn English to participate in the broader culture of their place. And when they were thrust here, it becomes this sort of extenuating circumstance. So if this ruling was temporary, you know, for 2 years or whatever until people can get it settled around, that would be one thing. But it's obviously going to be permanent, and I'm hoping that we take another look at that from a legislative point of view.
And I want to pick up on that in a few minutes, but Kramer, what has been the reaction within the Hispanic community to this ruling and the opportunity to make voting a little bit easier for those who are not proficient at English?
Well, like you said, the influx of Puerto Ricans in our state is changing a little bit the way that we see politics right now, and we should accommodate them. They're citizens, the law says it, and yeah, we should accommodate everyone so they can understand. Going a little further, keeping this as a matter that we're going to keep for every election, having English and Spanish options for voters. I think it's a very good option because if you look at the amendments candidates, the bundles that they've done, it's complicated even for someone to speak plain English.
You don't say. Okay, so we did the easy part here so far. We're going to get into our conversation a little bit more. Our conversation on Florida having ballots in Spanish continues. Welcome back. We are talking about Spanish language ballots, and joining us for more are Kramer Verde, an activist in the Sarasota Hispanic community, Rod Thompson of the RevolutionaryAct.com, and Ron Turner, Sarasota's election supervisor. So Ron, again, how quickly did you and your counterpart in Manatee really have to jump into action to try to get this done?
Well, very quickly, because we had already been working with the vendor that produces our sample ballots. So part of the artwork for that sample ballot for this general election, not the ballot itself, but instructions and other things had already been submitted to the company that produces this. So we had to pull those things kind of out of production and reconfigure the sizes and obviously the translations and things like that to be able to make this happen, because the sample ballots are being mailed October 10th, so that's not something we start on October 9th. This is something that happens weeks and weeks ahead of time to prepare.
And the thought just occurs to me that now you've had the death of the Democratic nominee in the 17th Congressional District, and
right.
you are already beyond, you know, it's almost impossible for you to correct the ballot situation with that. This makes it even more complicated.
It does. You know, with that situation, once a replacement nominee for the Democratic Party is named, then we will, you know, place notices and vote by mail ballots in a voting booth at that point. But at this juncture. We don't have that information. It hasn't been done yet. So vote by mail ballots are already being prepared because, you know, we're sending out 60 some odd thousand on October 2nd. So again, that's not something that starts October 1st. I mean, those are things that are being done now.
Right.
So,
and we'll talk about the other issues that we were going to talk in terms about the bigger picture in a little bit, but rather you concerned about the confusion that all of this is going to create in this election, not just because of the death of the Democratic candidate, but because, you know, this is a big undertaking to begin with.
Yeah, I assume that when you have to rush something that you're not expecting to have to do, it creates the opportunity for errors and mistakes, omissions, things that then, unfortunately, if there really were something of substance, consider the option I'm just thinking about right now, that if there was something of real substance that was in error on, say, the gubernatorial or the Senate race or something, or even a local congressional race.
Ballot questions.
Right, or ballot questions, but I'm thinking, and there's a very, very close outcome, and there's something challengeable, you know, based on having to rush this quickly in, that creates a bit of a bad scenario for people like Ron Turner.
Right. And Kramer, I'm going to get to you in a moment. Sorry,
I was
Ron.
going to say, bite your tongue there.
We are just getting warmed up on our conversation on Florida having ballots in Spanish. We'll continue in just a moment, so stay with us. Welcome back, everyone. We are talking about Spanish language ballots, and joining us for more are Kramer Verde, an activist in the Sarasota Hispanic community, Rod Thompson of the RevolutionaryAct.com, and Ron Turner, Sarasota's election supervisor. So, Kramer, let me start with you, because around the country, in places like Los Angeles or New York, there are ballots in a whole bunch of different languages. I think you said like in 32 in
Yes,
LA.
many states have different languages.
The question that Rod is going to raise is, does this slow down the assimilation of new immigrants into the fabric of American life?
Of course not. If you're an immigrant and you come here to the States, the very first thing you'll learn is that if you learn the language, you will make more money. So that's a very logical process for the community. Now, when you go to a voting place and you're presented with a ballot that you don't understand, you're not very familiar with the terms that are being used. And like I was saying before, for people that are naturally speaking English is English, the ballot right now in English is a bit confusing because of all the bundling and, you know, what you have to understand about the issue, what they're trying to propose or change or adapt. So I think it's fair for the country, and you know, maybe according the state and the minority groups and how diverse it is, to offer this, you know, as a
permanent basis.
On a permanent basis, because it's easier for them to understand. You know, if you see people that came here when they were younger, very young, they probably have a native language. I don't want to say Spanish because there are many nationalities here in this country. They also have learned English, and when they have family gatherings, even though everybody speaks English, sometimes they're going to speak the native language because they feel more comfortable that way. Why can't we just do that? I mean, I heard coming from Mike Bennett saying that will hold them down. They will not let them learn the language of the country. I don't think that's a reason. The reason is that I think if we improve our ballots, we make them understand what they're voting for, I think that will make a more better educated decision. Right. I don't see a problem with that.
We were talking earlier that even in English, the language on some of these ballot questions is downright confusing to all of us who learned English from the get-go here. You could imagine if English is your second language, it is that much tougher. Aren't we better off with people knowing what they're voting for and voting against?
Well, I think that it's the bigger picture that I have an issue with. And like Kramer was saying, I look to California as sort of the canary in the coal mine here, because California has had now for many generations, they've made it as comfortable and easy as possible for Spanish speakers to not have to learn English, and then to survive, if not thrive, in a very small community compared to the larger, American culture of Spanish. And that's Spanish in the schools, that's Spanish in the stores, that's Spanish on their jobs, Spanish on the ballots. The problem with that then is that now there you have in California, you have multiple generations who aren't learning English at all. They're not even really bilingual because they're not really being pushed to. I think there's a certain responsibility on the part of the government to push them towards that, because I think it does inhibit their ability to participate in the broad American dream and culture if they're not fluent in English, given the fact that the first generation, it's going to be hard on the first generation to learn it.
Let me give you an opportunity.
Yes, I think that's incorrect, because what you see in this generation of younger families, when you have the kids, most likely the kids, they don't even speak the language. They don't even speak English. They came here with a native language, Spanish. They learn English, and in time they actually forget the language. So only the parents are the ones that that are speaking Spanish. Yes, they need to learn English. I think it will be for their advantage to learn. But what's the problem to having people who speak another language?
Ron, let me ask you this question, because you raise the issue that it's one thing for the Division of Elections in Tallahassee or the Secretary of State to give you the language needed for the constitutional revision questions that could be on the ballot, but we have local questions, and you were forced to go out and find your own interpreter to translate these questions.
Yes, and that's the way that counties do that in Florida. If they have local kind of issues or races where you don't have kind of a common translations, you would need to get them translated. Plus, I wanted to make sure that if I was doing this, that I'm doing it correctly, to try to, and Kramer and I talked about this, using a universal form of Spanish, a Castilian form of Spanish, not trying to pick up a dialect necessarily, just like the English language, using something that's universal in nature. So those type of things that you have to consider. And I wanted to make sure, okay, we have to do this now. So, what are the steps that we need to do to be able to put this in place as quickly as possible and make this usable as the intent of what the judge ruled in this case and what the state of Florida is requiring us to do in this case.
But it raises the question, who is fact-checking or copy editing the work of the translator to make sure it is true to the question in English?
Well, that's a good question, right? There's always a lot of proofing that goes on with ballots. We talked about that a little bit off camera to try to make sure that everything is correct, like these questions, even in English, that you've got every comma in the right place, every period in the right place, and that's quite a process to be able to do that. In this case, we're talking about sample ballots. We're not talking about actual ballots that people are going to be voting on. The intent was to use it, or I believe the intent was, let me say that, was to use it as a reference document. The judge asked us to keep the layout similar to what we would have the regular ballot from. He wasn't even requiring us to use our ballot layout software to lay out this ballot. I mean, you could do a type of composite ballot per se, and not have it look like the official ballots. But, it's...
Does that preclude the possibility that on a close vote, let's say on a local ballot question, that there could not be litigation because in the end, the real ballot is in English and the vote is cast on that? On the other hand, I could imagine somebody taking issue and just saying the translation was not accurate.
Well, I think, you certainly raise a point, and in this business, I've learned a long time ago that...
what can go wrong will go wrong.
Well, and I mean, right now, there's a couple local questions that are on the ballot. There's a suit to try to have them removed from the ballot, as a preliminary injunction type thing. So those are kind of, I think, I don't want to say normal part of business, but in a sense, it is. So, we take it every day at a time. We take our job seriously. We take access seriously. My job is to comply with the law, and that's what I'm doing. So we'll cross any hurdles at that time. But
the purposes of this court action, or at least the judge's ruling right now, is for this election only. Is the intent here to make this permanent, that from here on out there will be Spanish?
That's my understanding, unless something changes with that, like an appeal in court. I don't believe the state of Florida is appealing this. I don't know if any of the counties... because the counties weren't sued directly, the 31 counties. Alachua County was sued, and then the state of Florida was sued. Initially, they were talking about a class action suit. but the judge asked the Secretary of State to use directive powers to direct us to do this in the 32 counties. So the governor and the Secretary of State have said, I don't think there are going to be any appeals on this. So the assumption is that yes, and that is my understanding and my plan at this point would be to continue this forward unless something changes.
We only have a minute left here, but Rod, this seems to be the way things are going across the country, not just in blue states or red states, but in a lot of states. Is the bottom line going to be that one way or the other, get used to it, you're going to have Spanish language ballots for those who need it?
Yeah, well, it could be, and I will still contend that it's a bad idea. Worst of all, a bad idea for Spanish speakers eventually. But the politics of this is a little bit interesting too, because when this ruling came out, Governor Scott is in the midst of a heated senatorial campaign, clearly doesn't want to have to deal with this issue. While there is no plan to appeal this now, or for, as far as I know, for the legislature to create a law covering it that then would have to go through the judicial process because it would undoubtedly be challenged. That could happen after the election, depending on who wins and who's in the legislature.
Okay, we are going to take a quick break once again, and Kramer, I'm going to get you in a moment. We'll be back for final thoughts in a moment. Stay with us. And our guest joining us right now for final thoughts. So Kramer, I want to start with you because again, you're thinking whether you're dealing with real estate like you do professionally or voting, some of the language is so complicated that people who relocate here can use that kind of help.
Yes, of course, the majority of them are fluent in English, but they prefer to understand, have a better understanding, or someone that explains them in a language that they feel the most comfortable. In this case, will be Spanish. So I hope that these measures taken for this election stay for a very long time. Maybe time will decide, how people learn the language. I'm a very big advocate of voting by mail because of the complexity of the ballot and how many questions and the bundles that we have there. And I think it's a fair way to actually educate the community so they understand very well what they're voting for.
Rod, what would be the compromise here? Because you say you don't have an objection to Puerto Ricans who relocated here, but should there be a time limit on, or should there be a time limit on all new citizens who are learning to become Americans, that maybe they have 5-7 years, and then by then they have to vote, on English ballots? Well,
I don't know how the second one would work because we have obviously a continual stream of immigrants coming all the time. So I don't know how you would craft a law that would would allow that to work. But on the first point, that would be the ideal thing because to me, this is an unusual situation. These aren't people immigrating to our country, right? Gaining legal status, being able to vote legally. These are American citizens now. They just are in a quirky situation where they're in this island that is not a state, but they're American citizens with full American citizen rights, and they've been thrust into Florida because of the natural disaster, and they would like to exercise their voting right, which is understandable.
Ron, status report. Are you ready with these sample ballots?
We are. So I'd like to tell all the voters that we will be mailing sample ballots to anyone that doesn't have a vote by mail ballot request around October 10th. They will get in an envelope an English version and a Spanish version that we've been instructed to do, so we'll get both. We'll also have sample ballots online in the next few days, which will have the English and the Spanish versions. We will also be advertising them in the newspaper, as we're required to do. And then if anyone needs assistance, they can certainly contact us or ask for assistance at a polling location if anyone needs help voting. But back to something Kramer said. He said he was an advocate for vote by mail. Well, so am I. This was earlier in your broadcast that I've asked today for voters in Sarasota County to really consider voting by mail as a possibility for this general election. It's a long ballot, 17 inches long, front and back. 12 questions from the state, 6 at the county level, 2 from the municipalities, in addition to dozens of federal, state, and local races. So think about voting by mail.
Fantastic conversation. Thank you all tonight. We want to thank our guest, Kramer Verde, an activist in the Sarasota Hispanic community, Rod Thompson of the RevolutionaryAct.com, and Ron Turner,